He checked the cameras, expecting to find a theft. A stolen bottle of whiskey, maybe. A photograph taken of his documents. Something that would confirm what 42 years of living in the shadows had taught him. That everyone, eventually, takes something from you when they think you are not watching. He was one of the most feared men alive. A Korean mafia boss worth billions, with dragon tattoos climbing his neck, and a reputation that made entire rooms go quiet the moment his name was spoken. He had boarded his private jet alone that night, 50,000 feet above the Pacific, untouchable, unreachable, sealed inside the kind of power that most people will never come close to in their entire lives. She was a black flight attendant, assigned to him by accident. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know what he controlled. She only knew one thing about him, something she saw without being told, something she recognized because she had worn the same expression herself every single day for 3 years. He was grieving. And while this Korean mafia boss slept alone in the dark of that jet, this black woman did something that no rival, no enemy, no ally in his entire life had ever done. She saw him. Not the empire, not the power, not the tattoos or the tailored suit or the billion-dollar silence around him. She saw the father. And what she left for him while he slept was something so unexpected, so quietly devastating, that when he finally checked those cameras and watched what she had done in the dark, this man, who had not broken in 23 years, wept. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click Join to become a member and help our channel. There is a kind of silence that only exists at 35,000 feet. Not the silence of empty rooms or quiet streets. Those silences still carry the residue of the world. The distant sound of a television through a wall. The faint pressure of a city breathing below a window. The silence inside a private jet, cruising at altitude in the middle of the night over the Pacific Ocean, is different. It is total. It is sealed. It is the silence of a place that has been deliberately separated from everything that exists below it. The traffic and the arguments and the grief and the noise of ordinary human life. At that altitude, the world beneath becomes theoretical. It becomes something you can look down at through a small oval window and feel, for the span of a few hours, entirely removed from. Ryu Jae-hyun had always preferred that silence. He had built his entire life around versions of it. Rooms that no one entered without permission. Conversations that ended the moment he stopped speaking. A perimeter of fear so perfectly maintained that the silence around him had become architectural. People did not wander near him. People did not ask questions. People performed their function and disappeared. And that was the order he had constructed over 23 years with the kind of patience and ruthlessness that most men could not sustain for 23 days. He was not a man who was feared because he was loud. He was feared precisely because he was not. The jet had lifted from Incheon at 11:47 at night, and by the time it leveled into its cruising altitude, Ryu had already dismissed the pilot's courtesy check-in, declined the initial beverage offer from the woman who introduced herself as Soraya, and opened the leather document folder that his chief of operations had prepared for the Los Angeles meeting. 14 pages. Projections, contacts, exposure risks, contingency language. He read each page the way he read everything. Completely, without expression, retaining everything and revealing nothing. He did not notice the way Soraya Monroe moved through the cabin. He was not the kind of man who noticed things like that. Not because he lacked perception, but because he had long ago made the decision that people in service roles were to be registered only as functions. A flight attendant was a variable. She existed at the edges of the environment, providing what was needed and remaining otherwise absent. He had no curiosity about her. He had no curiosity about anyone who could not affect his plans. What he did not know, what he could not have known from inside the impenetrable logic of his own constructed world, was that Soraya Monroe had been watching the slight tension in his jaw since the moment she had served his first whiskey. Not because she was drawn to him, not because she recognized him, which she did not, but because Soraya had spent the last 3 years learning to read grief on faces the way other people read weather. Quickly, involuntarily, with the specific accuracy of someone who has worn the same expression and knows precisely what it costs to hold it still. She had seen it the moment he looked down at his documents and did not actually read them for the first 40 seconds. The eyes moving, yes, but not processing. The kind of reading that is actually just staring with a purpose attached to it, so that no one asks what is wrong. She recognized it because she had done it herself. On planes, on buses, in break rooms and parking lots, and the chair beside her mother's hospital bed. The performance of function as a way of not existing in the feeling that was sitting directly underneath every breath. She said nothing. She served the second whiskey when he gestured. She checked the cabin temperature. She dimmed the lights at the appropriate hour and retreated to her station behind the partition. And Yoo Jae-hyun, who had not slept more than 2 consecutive hours in 6 years, closed his eyes in the blue dark of the cabin and did not expect to sleep. He did not expect what his own body would do when the silence became complete enough and the distance from the world became total enough, and the weight of 23 years of perfect stillness became, for just a few hours, too heavy to continue holding at 35,000 feet above the Pacific. His breathing slowed, and the photograph slipped. The photograph fell the way small things fall when the body finally surrenders to exhaustion. Not dramatically, not with warning, but with the quiet inevitability of something that had been held too tightly for too long. It slipped from between the leather band of the Patek Philippe and the inside of his wrist, where he kept it pressed against his pulse every hour of every day, and it landed face down on the cream carpet of the cabin floor, without a sound. Soraya saw it happen on her routine pass through the cabin. She almost kept walking. The protocol was clear, and 3 years of working these flights had trained her body to move through the cabins of sleeping passengers like water moves through a space. Present, necessary, and entirely without disturbance. She was not supposed to stop. She was not supposed to look at anything that belonged to a passenger with the kind of attention that implied interest. But she stopped. She crouched, slowly, the way she had learned to move in these tight, expensive spaces. Controlled, silent, her weight shifting without a single joint making a sound. She picked up the photograph with 2 fingers, careful as a person handling something they understand to be irreplaceable, without being told. And she turned it over. The little girl was laughing the kind of laugh that only exists in a specific window of childhood, somewhere between 2 and 5 years old, before the world teaches restraint. The mouth completely open, the eyes disappearing into the laugh, the kind of unguarded joy that looks, to anyone who has ever lost someone, like a photograph of a world that no longer exists. She was wearing a yellow dress. She was holding a melting ice cream cone that was losing the battle badly, dripping down over small fingers that did not care at all. And she had his eyes, unmistakably, undeniably his eyes, the same dark depth, except that on her face, those eyes were pointed entirely toward delight instead of distance. Soraya held the photograph for 4 seconds. She knew, with the specific knowledge of a person who has carried their own version of this weight, exactly what she was holding. Not just a photograph, the photograph. The one that lives closest to the body. The one that gets taken out in parking lots and airport terminals and the back seats of cabs when no one is watching. Held for 30 seconds and then carefully replaced before the world can see. She placed it gently on the side table where he would find it immediately upon waking. Then she straightened, checked the cabin temperature gauge on the wall panel, and walked back to her station behind the partition. She sat down in the narrow jump seat and looked at the ceiling of the aircraft for a long time. Little did she know that the act of placing that photograph, that single, quiet, unremarkable gesture, had already been captured by the 4 high-definition cameras that Ryu's security team had installed in every vehicle he used for travel, feeding to an encrypted cloud server that his head of security monitored remotely from Seoul. Every movement in that cabin was recorded. Every gesture. Every expression. And later, when he reviewed the footage himself, as he reviewed all footage involving his personal space, he would watch her pick up that photograph, and he would watch her face in the moment she turned it over. He would watch her stop. He would watch the 3 seconds in which Soraya Monroe, a woman who did not know him, who owed him nothing, who had every reason to place the photo and move on without a second thought, looked at the photograph of his daughter with an expression that no one in his immediate world had ever directed at him. Not pity, not discomfort, not the careful blankness of someone managing a professional situation. Recognition. The specific, bone-deep recognition of someone who understood loss not as a concept, but as a permanent resident. But that was later. In this moment, Ryu slept, and the photograph waited on the side table, and Soraya sat behind the partition with her hands folded in her lap, already knowing that she was going to do something that broke every professional protocol she had spent 3 years carefully maintaining. She opened her tablet. She opened the Notes application. And she began to write. What she wrote in the next 2 hours was not planned. It was not strategic. It was not composed with any awareness of who he was or what he controlled or what he could do with the knowledge that she had paused over his most private possession and felt something. She wrote the way people write when the altitude and the darkness and the silence have stripped away the performance of being fine. Honestly, and without the usual architecture of protection that daylight requires. She wrote about Marcus. Marcus Jerome Monroe had been 21 years old when he died, and he had laughed exactly like that little girl in the yellow dress. Soraya wrote that first, because it was the thing she had never been able to say out loud to anyone without the conversation immediately becoming about managing her grief rather than witnessing it. People were uncomfortable with specificity and loss. They preferred the general. He was so young. He is in a better place. Time heals. Because the specific details were the parts that made death real, and therefore unbearable to sit beside. But the specific details were also the only parts that kept Marcus alive in any meaningful sense, and so Soraya had learned to carry them privately in the Notes application of her tablet at 35,000 feet, where no one could see her face while she wrote them down. He had laughed with his whole body. That was the first specific. Not just his mouth. His shoulders would come up, his head would go back, and if something was truly funny, he would grab the nearest person by the arm as if he needed an anchor to keep from floating away from the force of it. He had done that since he was 4 years old, and he had never outgrown it. and Soraya had spent the last 3 years in crowded places, involuntarily scanning for that specific gesture. The reaching out, the anchor grab, in strangers, because her nervous system had not yet fully accepted that it would not find it. She wrote that down. She wrote about the phone call she had not been able to take because the seatbelt sign was illuminated and she was securing the beverage cart in the galley of a commercial flight from Atlanta to Denver. She wrote about landing 40 minutes later and finding 4 missed calls from her mother's number and knowing, before she pressed play on the voicemail, with the complete and terrible certainty of someone whose body had already processed the information before the mind had been informed. She wrote about sitting on the floor of the Denver airport bathroom in her full uniform, back against the wall of the stall, listening to her mother's voice say the words that rearranged every future she had imagined. And then she stopped writing about herself, because that was not what the folded paper was for. She understood that now, somewhere in the second hour of writing, the way understanding sometimes arrives not as a thought, but as a physical shift, a settling, a quiet click of purpose. She was not writing her grief. She was writing toward his. She wrote about what she had learned in 3 years of carrying Marcus with her. Not wisdom, not the clean lessons that grief memoirs package into readable chapters, but the raw and irregular truths that only reveal themselves slowly, in the dark, at altitude, when the performance of daily life is temporarily suspended. That the missing does not diminish, that it changes texture instead, from acute and blinding in the early months to something more like a permanent weather system that you learn to navigate rather than escape. That the people who leave do not take the love with them, that the love stays with nowhere to go, and that this is both the most devastating and the most important thing about it. She wrote, "Grief that has nowhere to go becomes the truest record of what someone meant to you." She wrote, "The fact that it still hurts this much is not a sign that something is wrong. It is the most accurate measurement of what was real." She wrote for 1 hour and 47 minutes without stopping. When she finished, she read it back once. Her hands were steady. Her face was dry. She had moved through something and come out the other side of it, the way writing sometimes allows, not healed, but reorganized, clarified. She printed it on the small printer mounted in the service galley, the same printer used for flight manifests and customs documentation, and the sound of it felt enormous in the silence of the cabin, though it lasted only seconds. She folded the paper into quarters with the careful precision of someone who understands that the container matters as much as the contents. She took the black pen from her breast pocket. On the outside fold, she wrote 8 words, "For whoever calls someone who no longer answers." S. She moved back into the cabin. He was still sleeping, deeper now, the terrible tension in his face partially released, the way faces sometimes release in sleep what they cannot release in waking. She placed the folded paper beneath the photograph of the little girl in the yellow dress so that he would find one before he found the other. She returned to her station. Outside the oval windows, the sky was beginning its slow, indifferent shift from black to the deep violet that comes before dawn. That color that exists for only a few minutes each morning and that most people sleep through without knowing it is happening. This quiet negotiation between darkness and light that the sky conducts entirely without audience, entirely without acknowledgement, whether anyone is watching or not. Soraya watched it. And 2 rows forward, still sleeping, Ryu Jae-hyun's hand moved in the dark and found, without waking, the empty place on his wrist where the photograph usually pressed against his pulse. His fingers closed around nothing. And even in sleep, something in his face understood the absence. Tightening, searching, before his body remembered where he was and the searching stopped, and the silence returned, and the jet carried them both, separately and together, through the last hours of the dark, toward a shore neither of them had expected. He found the photograph first. Ryu Jae-hyun came awake the way he always did, completely, instantly, without the soft border of transition that most people experience between sleep and consciousness. One moment he was under, and the next he was entirely present, eyes open, the cabin already being assessed before he had drawn his first waking breath. 42 years of survival had burned the luxury of gradual waking out of him entirely. His body treated every emergence from sleep as a potential threat situation, cataloging the environment before allowing anything as vulnerable as a feeling to surface. His eyes went immediately to the side table. The photograph was there, face up, exactly where she had placed it, which was not where it had been, which meant someone had touched it, which meant someone had seen it, and the familiar, cold architecture of his threat response began assembling itself in the space behind his sternum. The rapid, practiced construction of distance and assessment and controlled anger that had kept him alive through situations that had killed better-prepared men than him. And then he saw the folded paper beneath it. He did not move for 4 seconds. He simply looked at it. The neat quarters, the careful fold, the 8 words visible on the outside in a handwriting that was unhurried and unperforming. He had received thousands of communications in his life, contracts and threats and confessions and requests and declarations of loyalty and declarations of war. He had developed over decades an almost physical instinct for reading the intention behind a document before opening it, the weight of it, the presentation, the quality of restraint or urgency in how it had been prepared. This one had been written by someone with nothing to gain. He knew it before he opened it. He knew it the way you know certain things that your analytical mind cannot fully account for. In the body first, then the understanding. He unfolded it slowly, which was unusual for him. He was not a slow man. Slowness in his world was either performance or weakness, and he had no use for either. But he unfolded this slowly. He read it once straight through without stopping. Then he read it again. Little did Soraya know, seated behind the partition with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold, that the man reading her words in the blue-gray light of early morning was not processing them the way he processed information, analytically, extracting what was useful and discarding the remainder. He was reading them the way a person reads something that finds, with terrible accuracy, the exact location of the thing they have spent years building walls around. The words were not remarkable in their construction. They were not eloquent in any formal sense. They were simply true, and truth, when it is specific enough, when it carries the particular fingerprints of real experience rather than the smooth surface of performed comfort, does something that no amount of eloquence can replicate. It arrives. He reached the line. Grief that has nowhere to go becomes the truest record of what someone meant to you. And he stopped. He read it a 3rd time. Outside the oval window, Los Angeles was becoming visible through the early marine layer, the vast, sprawling geometry of the city emerging from the gray like something being slowly revealed rather than approached. He had landed in Los Angeles 11 times in the past 4 years. He had never once looked at it arriving. He looked at it now. His hand, resting on the armrest, found the photograph without him directing it there. His thumb moved across the surface of it, across the yellow dress, across the melting ice cream, across the face of Gia laughing with her mouth completely open, laughing the way she had laughed every single day of her 4 years, as though the concept of withholding joy had never been introduced to her, because it hadn't. Because he had kept the world at a distance sufficient to protect her from everything except the one thing that distance cannot stop. The one thing that finds everyone eventually, regardless of the perimeter. His eyes did not close. He did not make a sound. But the tear that moved down the left side of his face was not wiped away, which was the most significant thing. Because Ryu Jae-hyun had wiped away every tear for 6 years with the same reflexive efficiency with which he managed every other vulnerability. And this one he simply allowed. It fell. It reached his jaw. It was followed by another. He sat with it. When Soraya came through the cabin 12 minutes later to prepare for landing, she found him standing at the window, jacket on, folder under his arm, entirely composed in every external measurement. She began her pre-landing check without looking at him directly, as the protocol required, moving through the cabin with the quiet efficiency that had defined every hour of the flight. She was securing the side table latch when his voice came. Low, unhurried, directed at the window rather than at her. Her name was Gia. Soraya's hands stilled on the latch. She was 4 years old. She asked for this same song every night before she would sleep. I have not been able to remember the words for 6 years. I have tried every night for 6 years, and I cannot get them back. The cabin was completely silent except for the low pressure of the engines and the faint vibration of the aircraft beginning its slow, inevitable descent. Soraya straightened. She turned toward him. And she told him about Marcus. Not everything, not the full weight of it, but enough. The laugh, the arm grab, the airport bathroom floor. Enough that he would understand that the paper had not come from pity or professionalism or the careful management of a difficult passenger. It had come from the only place that anything true ever comes from. She took out her phone. She searched for the song. She pressed play. The melody that came through the small speaker was simple and old and entirely unimpressive by any musical standard. A Korean lullaby that had been sung by Korean mothers to Korean children for generations. Unremarkable in every way, except that it had been the last sound Gia Monroe had requested every night of the last year of her life, sung badly by a man who had never been able to carry a tune, and who his daughter had informed of this limitation repeatedly, and with great delight. Ryu Jae-hyun closed his eyes, and the last wall came down. Not with collapse, not with drama, with the quiet, structural inevitability of something that has been holding against pressure for 6 years, finally meeting the one force it was never designed to withstand. Not power, not threat, not the accumulated weight of everything he had survived. Kindness. Specific, unasked for, completely unmotivated kindness from someone who had nothing to gain and offered it anyway, in the dark, at altitude, while he slept. The wheels touched the tarmac at Van Nuys Airport at 7:34 in the morning. Neither of them spoke again before the door opened. But 3 weeks later, when the envelope arrived at Soraya's agency, the heavy paper, the careful handwriting, the figures that would change the entire trajectory of her mother's illness, and the 2 folded pages, one with numbers and one with words, she opened the second page last and found, in the bottom margin, in the same unhurried handwriting that had addressed the outside of the envelope, 4 words that she read standing in the agency parking lot in the early afternoon light, her caramel bag against her hip, her gold cross warm at her throat. I remembered. R.J.H. She folded the page. She held it against her chest for a moment, eyes closed, face turned slightly upward, not toward anything in particular, not in any gesture that could be named or categorized, but in the specific way of a person who is sending something wordless in the direction of someone who is no longer reachable by any ordinary means. Then she placed it carefully inside her bag, next to her phone, next to her keys, next to the small, worn things that a person carries closest to them through the ordinary and extraordinary hours of a life. And she went back to work. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever been in a moment where you could have walked past someone's pain, and you chose not to? Where you offered something real to someone who never expected kindness from you, and it cost you nothing but your willingness to see them? And have you ever carried a grief so private, so carefully hidden behind strength and silence, that you forgot what it felt like for someone to simply look at you and recognize it, without pity, without agenda, just recognition? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about compassion, redemption, and the quiet power of human connection, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click Join to become a part of our community and help the channel.